The sun rises just above the horizon as you walk out of your home and into your garden. As you tend to your vegetables, you hear something up the road. A crowd of people is headed down the path, and it looks like they're headed to town. You stop them to ask why they're going to town, and they tell you that today is the day that Bridget was sentenced to be executed. You hadn't been to town in a few days, and hadn't heard that Bridget had done anything wrong, so you join the group and make your way to town square. A large pile of wood and straw was set in the center of town. All the townsfolk had formed a circle around it, and you could hear them as they talked amongst themselves. They spoke about Bridget putting a curse on her neighbor, causing him to die suddenly last week. Supposedly, she was in love with him, and when he rejected her, she turned to the devil to have her revenge. Surely none of this talk could be true. You've known Bridget for years. She wouldn't hurt anyone. As the thought crosses your mind, a sudden commotion arises from the other side of the crowd. Bridget is being led to the woodpile, her wrists shackled and her face bloodied. A hooded man holding a torch stands silently beside her, while she is tied to a post at the center of the pile. A man steps out and addresses the townsfolk. Bridget Balfour, accused of being in league with the devil and using his influence to kill an innocent man, has confessed to these crimes. She admits her deal with the devil and her use of witchcraft to commit murder. She has been sentenced to burn at the stake. May God have mercy on her soul. At that, the executioner lowers his torch to the straw, and it quickly catches. The fire spreads rapidly, and soon the flames are licking Bridget's feet and ankles. She screams in agony, but abruptly silences herself. Her lips quickly snap shut, and as the fire creeps up her legs and reaches her torso, she once again opens her mouth. Her voice suddenly breaches the roar of the fire, and her final words can be heard, clear, calm, and powerful. You are all doomed to meet the devil. He rules over you now. You will face his judgment, and you will all drown in his lake of fire. I am but one of his loyal servants, but there are more like me among you, and you will never silence us all. With that, the flames engulf Bridget, and the crowd immediately begins looking to their neighbors. Who else among you is working with the devil, and who might be the next target of one of their wicked curses? The townsfolk quickly retreat back into their homes. The tension is thick, and suspicion hangs over the town like a dark cloud. Chaos looms on the horizon as you hear your neighbors preparing themselves for the worst. Your town is going to war with witches. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Lone Crow Podcast. I'm your host, Douglas Mackay. Tonight, we're going to take a look at witches, but this is a very broad topic. So for this episode, we will focus on the witch trials that took place in Europe from the 15th to the 18th century. In later episodes, we'll move to America to cover the infamous Salem witch trials and look into what witchcraft is today. With that said, let's begin. So what is a witch? Witches are men and women that were believed to have access to magic through herbal or spiritual means. This was common in many cultures throughout history, but the negative connotations that became associated with magic and witches didn't really come into being until those cultures collided with religions that believed those practices to be evil. In 1487, a book titled Malleus Maleficarum was published that would influence how the world perceived witches entirely. Second only to the Bible in sales, Malleus Maleficarum, often translated to the Hammer of Witches, became a witch hunter's guide of sorts. Written primarily by a German monk named Heinrich Kramer, he argued that witches were real and that they worked with the devil. The book explained in legal terms how to hunt and execute witches. Its influence was only heightened by a proclamation printed in the front of the book by Pope Innocentius VIII. Although this book was seen by some top theologians of the Inquisition as promoting unethical and illegal procedures, as well as being inconsistent with Catholic doctrines of demonology, it became extremely popular and was used as a guide for more than 200 years. It was this book that nearly single-handedly escalated witchcraft and sorcery to the criminal status of heresy. It taught that inquisitorial practices should be used to root out and eliminate witches. Those practices included torture to acquire a confession and, quite often, a death sentence for anyone found guilty of witchcraft. So this has all been a long way of getting to what the definition of a witch became during the years of the Inquisition. It was at this point in time where witchcraft became synonymous with devil worship. There were 6 activities witches were believed to have engaged in: entering into a pact with the devil, sexual relations with the devil, aerial flight, attending assemblies presided over by the devil, This is where initiates entered their pacts with the devil and acts of incest and promiscuous sex were engaged in, the practice of magic, and the slaughter of infants. So with those guidelines established, how did people actually go about hunting witches? First and foremost, it was said that the majority of witches were women. According to the Hammer of Witches, this was due to women being weaker than men physically and spiritually. It also noted that a woman's lust was the basis of all witchcraft, which put an emphasis on there being a link between sexuality and witchcraft. Witch hunts began with an accusation. Whether a witness or just a person with a hunch came forward, there would be an investigation into the accused. The investigation would start with a physical examination of the supposed witch. The examination was essentially a thorough search of the accused person's body to search for any, quote, instruments of witchcraft, end quote. Also called a devil's mark. This could include any kind of mark on the body, scars, birthmarks, moles, etc. In order to find these marks, a woman would be stripped down and shaved in order to make those marks more visible. Other instruments could have been objects that the woman had concealed on her person. Now, not all of these instruments of witchcraft were physical, though. It was believed that there were personality traits or emotional tells that could help identify a witch. For example, if a woman couldn't cry during torture or in the presence of a judge, it was seen as a sign that she was a witch. Another way of testing the accused included a method known as swimming a witch. This was the practice of dunking them in water. If they sank, they were deemed innocent, but if they floated, they were considered a witch. Now, this had to do with the belief that a witch's body would reject the waters of baptism and thus would float on top of it. This method usually meant that, sink or swim, the accused was most likely going to die. Finding any supposed evidence of witchcraft wasn't enough for a conviction, though. A confession was needed by the accused, and the Hammer of Witches stated that torture or deception were perfectly reasonable means of obtaining one. Now, once a confession was provided, there were a few methods of punishment. The one I've heard about the most was burning at the stake, but some were hung or beheaded as well. Capital punishment wasn't the only recourse, though. Some witches were fined, imprisoned, or exiled. If a confession was not given even after torture, the church couldn't proceed with punishing the alleged witch, but after some time passed, they could pass her on to a secular court that wouldn't be bound by the limitations of the church's rules. All of these rules and guidelines, stated in one book with the credibility of the Pope attached to it, would lead to over 200 years of witch hysteria, and some estimate up to 60,000 executions of accused witches. That number doesn't include unofficial lynchings or deaths caused by the horrid conditions that the prisoners had to deal with. Now let's take a look at some stories of witches and witchcraft starting in 1581. The witch trials of Trier in Germany may have been the biggest witch trials in European history. It began in 1581 in the Diocese of Trier. Johann von Schulenburg was appointed Archbishop of the independent Diocese of Trier, and he greatly admired the order of the Jesuits. He built them a college, and in an effort to prove his convictions, he ordered the elimination of 3 groups of society. First, he targeted Protestants, then people of Jewish faith, and finally witches. Between 1587 and 1593, 368 people were burned alive for sorcery in 22 villages around Trier. People of all ages, sexes, and classes were executed. 108 men, women, and children of the nobility, as well as those with positions in the government and administration, were put to death. One victim was a chief judge of the electoral court. Dietrich Flede opposed the persecutions, didn't agree with the use of torture, and treated the accused very mildly. For his trouble, he was arrested, tortured, strangled, and then burned. This made the witch trials even worse, as it was effectively removing any opposition to the trials. The sheer number of executions were so great that the population rapidly decreased, leaving 2 villages with only 1 female inhabitant in each. The prosperity of the executioner was evident, as he was described as riding about on a fine horse, quote, like a nobleman of the court, dressed in silver and gold, while his wife vied with the noble women in dress and luxury. The persecution of anyone opposing the witch trials only led to a rapid spread of witch hysteria, and eventually it would leave Germany and reach Scotland in 1590. The North Berwick witch trials were the trials of a number of people from East Lothian, Scotland. Between 70 and 200 people were implicated over the course of 2 years. The accused allegedly held masses on the Aldkirk Green. The majority of this information comes from a 1591 pamphlet called News from Scotland. The story begins when King James VI was traveling to Denmark to collect his bride, Anne of Denmark, in 1589. On his crossing of the sea, a storm hit so severely that it forced the king to take refuge on the coast of Norway. They were plagued with storms for the return journey as well, and the admiral of the escorting Danish fleet blamed the storms on witchcraft. Several nobles of the Scottish court were implicated, and witchcraft trials were held in Denmark. One of the first Danish victims was Anna Koldings, who, under pressure, divulged the names of 5 other women. They all confessed that they had been guilty of sorcery in raising storms that plagued Queen Anne's voyage, and that they had sent devils to climb up the keel of her ship. In September, 2 women were burnt as witches at Kronborg. These events changed King James's views on witchcraft, and he became obsessed with the persecution of witches in Scotland. In 1590, a young servant named Gillis Duncan from a small town near Edinburgh had been arrested for suspected witchcraft after some of her healing cures were branded as miraculous and the work of a witch. Gillis denied any kind of dealings with the devil initially, but after torture and the discovery of a so-called devil's mark on her neck, she confessed to being a witch and having sold her soul to the devil. After even more torture, she named several other accomplices, including the witches from Denmark that had confessed to creating the storms, and a woman named Agnes Sampson. Agnes Sampson was a midwife and had been accused of being the most senior witch in the coven. She was examined by King James himself at his palace. She was fastened to the wall of her cell by a witch's bridle. This was an iron instrument with 4 sharp prongs forced into the mouth, so that 2 prongs pressed against the tongue and the other 2 against the cheeks. She was kept fastened and forced to stay awake until she finally confessed that she and her coven had met with the devil in order to kill King James. King James wasn't convinced, though, not until Agnes supposedly repeated pillow talk that the king had shared with his new wife while they were alone. This became all the evidence he needed, and he declared Agnes a witch. On January 28, 1591, Agnes was taken with a group of other convicted witches to be executed. They were strangled to death and then burned. King James now felt he had uncovered a conspiracy against him and his kingdom, and his personal involvement with the trials gave witch hunting a credibility only royal approval could provide. Witch trials spread across Scotland over the following years, with hundreds more being accused of and executed for witchcraft. The spread didn't stop in Scotland, though. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth died, and King James VI, her cousin, inherited the throne. Now crowned King James I of England, he carried his obsession with witches and witchcraft to his new kingdom. Up until this point in time, England had very little experience with mass witch trials. The English people also had very little experience with their new king. They knew little about him, but what they did know came from a book that King James himself had written, Demonology. In it, he explains that witches and sorcerers are everywhere, and anyone that didn't think so was either fooling themselves or in league with the devil. In 1605, King James once again got himself involved in a case against witchcraft. In August of that year, a man named Brian Gunter, a wealthy and well-connected man, was granted an audience with the king. He presented his daughter to the king and claimed that she had been cursed by 3 witches. Gunter claimed his daughter would fly into violent fits that caused contortions and spasms. After having the girl examined, it came to light that she had been faking her symptoms. Her father had put her up to it, as he was at odds with one of the 3 women that he had implicated. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for wasting the king's time. Now, this case shows that even though King James was certain that witches and witchcraft were real, he also needed to be sure that the accused were actually guilty. This highlights a direct contrast between demonology and the hammer of witches. King James's book wasn't a way to make people hate witches, but a way for people to reach a conclusion through rational argument rather than superstition. Unfortunately, the people reading his book didn't see the subtleties within its pages, and 7 years later, in 1612, a time of mass witch trials erupted in England. On March 18, 1612, on a road to Colne, a young girl named Alison Device was out begging. She stopped a man named John Law, a peddler from Halifax, and asked him for a pin. He refused and continued walking. Now, according to her own unsolicited confession, it was at this moment that her, quote, familiar spirit appeared in the shape of a black dog. It asked her if she would like it to harm John Law. She came from a family of healers and magic users, and seems to have resisted the family business up until this point. She felt it necessary that Law be punished, and requested that the familiar lame the man. To her surprise, John Law fell to the ground, paralyzed down one side of his body and unable to speak. Alison was brought before the local magistrate, Roger Nowell. From that moment, the witch crisis escalated at an alarming rate, and by the end of April, 19 people were incarcerated in Lancaster Castle. At the end of the 2-day trial, 10 of the 19 were convicted of witchcraft. With witch hysteria now spreading rapidly through England, as well as a budding civil war, a new career became available for one man, Matthew Hopkins, the first and only career witch hunter. Little is known about Hopkins prior to 1644, but some say he was a lawyer practicing in Essex. In March of 1644, he claimed his first discovery of witches. He claimed that a coven of witches resided in his hometown of Manningtree. By the time of the trials, at least 30 women were being held for suspected witchcraft. 15 of the accused were found guilty and sentenced to death. Considering that in the 20 years prior to these trials, only 2 women had been executed for being witches, the hanging of 15 became a huge deal. This incident put him on the road to becoming the first paid witch hunter in England's history. Dubbing himself the Witchfinder General, he began traveling village to village and town to town, getting townsfolk to hire him and his assistants to search for witches, force their confessions, and have them hanged by the local authorities. And it's important to note that Hopkins had no legal authority to do any form of witch hunting after the trials in his hometown. He was only granted authority to do so by his local magistrates, and only for the one case that was now closed. This didn't stop him though, and due to the chaos of the Civil War, no one else was going to stop him either. He traveled to Suffolk after reading a pamphlet the townsfolk put out about a witch. Feeling confident after the trials in Manningtree, he arrived ready to deal with the witch, but this was no ordinary case of witchcraft, as the accused witch happened to be an ordained clergyman. Reverend John Lowes had been the vicar of Bradiston for over 4 decades. Unfortunately, he was so greatly disliked by his parishioners that they accused him of being a witch. This was a risky target for Hopkins. No serving clergyman had ever been accused of witchcraft in England up to this point. He knew he had no choice but to obtain a confession, and to do so, he looked to the methods he had used in Manningtree. He kept John Lowes awake for days, forcing him to run around the room every few minutes. This was the most extreme force he could legally apply to get the confessions he needed, but John Lowes denied any association with the devil. With legal methods failing him, Hopkins turned to breaking the law to secure the confession. He turned to the previously mentioned method of swimming the witch. No one knows how many times John Lowes was dunked into the water, but in the end, the torture broke him. He admitted to witchcraft, but until the day of his execution, he never admitted to any dealings with the devil. In the summer of 1645, Reverend John Lowes was headed to the hangman's noose. Never severing his connection with his God, he performed his own funeral service. Hopkins had now crossed the line of legality to have a man of the cloth convicted and executed for witchcraft. His popularity rose ever higher, and soon he was operating in a territory of nearly 300 miles, as villagers requested his services more and more. He was overseeing hundreds of interrogations and attending more and more trials. He was selling fear, and business was booming. But he needed to be paid, and as he became more popular, his fees steadily increased. Soon his payments were so high that for villages to be able to afford his services, local taxes were being increased, and that's when the villagers began to scrutinize Hopkins and his business. A Puritan preacher by the name of John Gall opposed all that Hopkins represented. He openly criticized Hopkins for his self-interest in finding witches and saw him as incompetent. Hopkins responded to the criticism as any well-balanced person would, by reminding the preacher that he had already sent one man of God to the gallows, and he could do it again. Instead of backing down, though, Gall decided to share his thoughts with all that he could reach. He penned a document titled Select Cases of Conscience Touching Witches and Witchcraft. In it, he objected to the torture that Hopkins used to gain confessions. He openly disagreed with many aspects of what was considered witchcraft as well. The idea of an imp or familiar, such as the dog in Alison Device's case, he suspected was little more than superstition and came from no source of scripture. He also distinguished between the workings of a magician and the spells of a witch, leaving room for the former to operate free of sin. Gall also pointed out that the majority of the witches that Hopkins targeted were easy targets. The elderly, the weak, the disabled, and the hated were not only suspected of witchcraft, but pronounced to be a witch. He called out Hopkins as nothing more than a con man that had invented the job to make money. Hopkins decided to push back by writing his rebuttal in a pamphlet titled The Discovery of Witches. In it, he printed the allegations against him alongside his responses. He denies that he was running a money-making scam, claiming to only charge 20 shillings for his services. Unfortunately for him, records were kept of the payments that villages and towns had made to him, and they greatly exceeded 20 shillings. He also attempted to justify his use of illegal torture by quoting King James's book Demonology. His defense was that because King James, who at this point had been dead for over 20 years, said it was okay. As you can imagine, this defense was not nearly strong enough for those that disagreed with his methods. Hopkins would never face judge or jury for his crimes, though, as on August 12, 1647, back in the village of Manningtree where it all began only 2 years prior, he died by what many believe was tuberculosis. In that short time, though, he was responsible for the deaths of over 100 people. We're going to end on that story for now, but much like the other episodes I've done, I'll be revisiting these topics to do some story-only episodes. Now I want to quickly discuss why accusations and stories of witches became so prominent. There are a few different theories that have been put forward. According to some, witch hysteria and subsequent witch trials followed what became known as the Little Ice Age. This was a period of about 500 years between 1300 and 1870 in which Europe and North America were hit by much colder winters. This created floods, storms, frosts, and plagues of rodents and insects, which in turn created famine due to crop failure, as well as the spread of disease. Some say that witch hunts tended to correspond with these ecological disasters, essentially stating that these disasters were believed to have been caused by witchcraft. Another theory has to do with competition between the Catholic Church and the quickly growing Protestants. The theory states that as competition grew between the two, they had to expand beyond standard spiritual services and move into protections from evil on earth. It claims that among both Catholics and Protestants, witch hunting became an effective service for attracting more followers by showing their ability to protect them from all forms of evil. One obvious factor that I think is important not to gloss over is the inherent misogyny of the time. Women were not seen as equal. It was believed that they were less intelligent and more easily tempted into sin. That belief, combined with the belief that misfortune had to have some magical cause, led to an extremely destructive perfect storm of sorts. On top of these already misogynistic views, some historians believe that widows were often targeted specifically. This was due to widows gaining control of their husband's estate after they had died, and if another man wanted what she now had, he could simply accuse her of witchcraft and have her effectively removed from the transaction. So what was it that made the idea of witches and witchcraft so scary? I think it's fair to say that in the case of witches, the fear was created by the religions that deemed them the enemy. They traded fear for followers, creating an enemy that only the church could protect them from. They made witches these dangerous people that worked directly with the most evil being in existence, and by doing so scared people into faith. But that fear soon grew out of control as individuals began to use it for their own personal gain. The outcasts of society soon became the victims of it, as a social cleansing began. Tens of thousands of people would lose their lives in Europe, not for crimes they committed, but for their social standing, their abilities or disabilities, their personalities, or their possessions, all justified by a fear that was taught by the most respected members of society. As I mentioned before, I'm not going to go into modern-day beliefs in witchcraft, as I want to keep this episode very specific to the European witch trials of the Inquisition. I will be doing an episode on the Salem witch trials in the future, so maybe I'll dive into more modern beliefs in that episode. So as usual, we'll end the episode by having a look at witches in pop culture. Now, to be completely honest, when it comes to books about witches of the Inquisition, I have read very few, and the few that I have read are more history books than fiction. I've always had a fondness towards the history of witches, so books like Witch Craze, A New History of the European Witch Hunts by Anne Barstow are what I tend to gravitate towards. The same can be said for film. Witchfinder General from 1968, retitled Matthew Hopkins' Conqueror Worm, was a horror biography obviously based on the story of Matthew Hopkins. It starred Vincent Price, which gives it some horror cred in my books. And with video games, I think my favorite game starring witches is The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt. It has some nods to the Inquisition throughout and a lot of awesome monsters to fight as well. I'll admit, trying to think of some European witch-themed entertainment wasn't easy. It's a very specific genre, and I personally haven't dipped too much into it. That being said, if you have some suggestions on books, films, or games that I should try out, please let me know. Or, if you have a scary story you'd like to share on the podcast, email me at lonecrowpod@gmail.com. I'm still looking for more stories to put together into a listener story episode, so if you have one, I'd love to hear from you. You can join the murder on social media. Just search at @LoneCrow_pod on Instagram and Twitter, or follow me on Facebook at the Lone Crow Podcast. Subscribe to Lone Crow on YouTube. All episodes of the podcast will be posted on the channel, as well as my future horror projects that I have planned. Now, speaking of future projects, after reading about witches for the last 2 weeks, I've gotten really interested in the somewhat morbid topic of torture. And before you all allow that statement to be as creepy as it obviously is, let me explain. I'm thinking of starting a video series for the channel. One where I take a look at different torture methods and devices and their use throughout history. Now, if that sounds like something you'd be interested in learning about, let me know. Thank you to Cash Lewis for designing the Lone Crow logo and for doing all the artwork for the podcast. You can check him out on Instagram at illcashlewis. That's at ILLCASHLEWIS. Thank you to Brass Thulu for creating the theme song for the podcast. And last but not least, thank you to all of you listeners. I couldn't do this without you guys. Please rate and review the podcast anywhere you can. If you have CastBox, I recently discovered that the podcast is available on there, as well as iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and SoundCloud. And you can help a bunch by sharing the podcast with your horror-loving friends as well. Let's keep this community growing. Just quickly before I end, I'm going to apologize if you guys can hear the rain in the background, or if you had to listen to the rain in the background. I probably should have done this at the top of the show, but I didn't think about it until just now. Or if there's any different audio quality. I am in a new place right now. I just recently moved in with my girlfriend, and so we are kind of just getting settled, and I'm kind of in a back room with a little bit of echo. Other than that, thank you all very much for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Lone Crow Podcast.